He invited her to his wedding to humiliate her. Then the doors opened, and the room forgot how to breathe. The crystal chandeliers threw hard white light across the ballroom, but nothing in the polished glow could soften the way people looked at Lena Hart as she stood alone near the entrance, one hand wrapped around the strap of a simple black purse, the other steady at her side. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. 10 years ago, this room had been filled with a different kind of promise. Back then, Lena had worn a white dress that cost less than the flowers on the tables tonight, and she had smiled like a woman who believed love could survive anything if she gave it enough of herself. She had stayed up through sick nights and missed dinners, helped him chase his first contracts, and folded her own ambitions into the corners of his life until there was almost nothing left of her but habit and hope. Then Daniel Cross had taken all of that tenderness and turned it into a story for other people, a story where she was the woman who held him back, the wife who never quite fit, the quiet figure in the background while he climbed higher and higher. The divorce had been clean on paper and brutal in every place that mattered. Lena remembered the final signature, the scratch of the pen, the way his hand never trembled while hers did. She remembered walking out with one suitcase, one winter coat, and a silence so deep it felt like stepping underwater. Tonight, that silence followed her into the ballroom. She did not come to fight. She came because the invitation had arrived in a thick ivory envelope, addressed in Daniel's careful handwriting, as if neat ink could disguise cruelty. Everyone in the room seemed to know who she was before she said a word. Old classmates, old co-workers, old witnesses. Their smiles were small and sharp, the kind people use when they expect someone to shrink. At the center of it all stood Daniel in a tailored charcoal suit, one hand resting possessively at the waist of his new bride, a woman in diamonds and satin who laughed a little too loudly at something he said. He glanced up, saw Lena, and his expression changed by a fraction, just enough for her to notice. Just enough for her to know he had not expected her to look so calm. He lifted his glass, the gesture smooth and rehearsed, and began introducing her to the table with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Lena," he said, as if the name itself was a punchline. "My ex-wife." She always did know how to make an entrance. A few people chuckled. Someone lowered their head to hide it. Lena felt every stare in the room settle on her like a verdict. But she did not flinch. She let the moment hang there, cold and bright, and for the first time in years, Daniel saw nothing he could use against her. Only stillness. Only composure. Only a woman who had already survived the worst thing he had ever done to her. And somewhere beyond the music, beyond the polite laughter, beyond the polished surface of the night, something larger was about to arrive. The ballroom stayed perfectly still for one suspended breath, the kind of silence that only exists in rooms full of expensive people pretending not to stare. Lena felt it settle over her skin, cool as glass. Daniel's smile remained fixed, but his fingers tightened once around the stem of his champagne flute. He had expected her to arrive smaller than memory, quieter than regret, easier to dismiss in front of an audience that had once applauded him for every polished lie. Instead, she stood there with her shoulders straight and her expression unreadable, as if the years had not crushed her, only sharpened her edges. At the far end of the room, a string quartet played on, the violins thin and elegant beneath the low murmur of shock. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and whispered behind her hand. A man in a silver tie looked away too late. Lena noticed all of it, but none of it touched her. Not anymore. She had learned, in the long quiet after the divorce, that humiliation only worked on the part of a person that still needed permission to feel small. She did not need that permission now. Daniel set his glass down and motioned lightly toward the head table, the same casual gesture he might have used to direct a waiter. "Come on," he said, his voice carrying just enough to sound generous. "Do not stand there all night. People will think you are waiting for a better invitation." A few people laughed, but it was the brittle kind, the kind that sounded rehearsed the second it left their lips. Lena gave no reaction. She simply let her gaze pass over the room, over the silk dresses, the polished watches, the faces she once knew well enough to trust. Each of them had watched her vanish from Daniel's life and decided the story was over. None of them had asked what it cost her to rebuild herself from the inside out. None of them had seen the mornings when she sat alone at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, learning how to breathe without apology. None of them had seen her take every broken piece of her former life and turn it into something steady, something hers. Daniel took that silence as weakness, as he always had. He lifted a brow and leaned back in his chair with the easy arrogance of a man still certain the room belonged to him. "You look different," he said, letting the words hang there. "Better, I suppose, though that is not saying much." The table responded with a ripple of uneasy amusement. Lena almost smiled, but not because she was amused, because she remembered the last time he had said something like that, years ago in a kitchen lit by cheap yellow bulbs, when he had looked at her like she was an inconvenience he had mistaken for a wife. The man had thought he was teaching her her place. In truth, he had only taught her how to leave it behind. She folded her hands softly in front of her purse and met his eyes without a trace of heat. "You invited me here," she said, her voice calm enough to make his grin falter for the smallest instant. "So I assumed you wanted me to see something." Daniel's jaw shifted. The people around the table went quiet again, sensing the change without understanding it. Lena could feel the room leaning toward her now, drawn not by drama but by the strange, quiet force of someone who refuses to perform pain for an audience. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, footsteps approached, measured and unhurried, and the doorman turned his head toward the entrance as if he had just received a signal. Daniel noticed the movement too. His gaze flicked away from Lena, just for a second, and that was all it took for the air in the room to change. He did not know it yet, but the next person through those doors would not come to save her. He would come to stand beside her, and that difference would matter more than anyone in the room could imagine. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, carrying a weight that made the ballroom feel suddenly smaller. Lena did not turn right away. She kept her posture unchanged, one hand resting lightly near her purse, as if stillness itself could be a kind of shield. Daniel, however, could not help himself. His attention drifted past the mirrored walls and the tall arrangement of white orchids toward the entrance, where the staff had begun to move with unusual precision. A few guests noticed it too. Their laughter thinned. Their champagne flutes hovered halfway to their lips. Then the doors opened fully, and the man who stepped inside did not announce himself with noise or spectacle. He did not need to. He wore restraint the way others wore luxury, dark tailored lines, a watch that caught the light once and then disappeared back into shadow, and an expression that was calm in the most unsettling way. He scanned the room with a steady, assessing glance, the sort that made polished people straighten their shoulders without knowing why. Lena felt the air change before she saw the recognition in his face. It was there in the slightest pause, the faint softening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift from distance to intention. Daniel, still facing the doorway, frowned as if trying to place a figure from memory, but his mind had not yet caught up to what the room already sensed. The newcomer crossed the marble floor with measured steps, each one quiet enough to make the silence feel louder. When he reached Lena, he did not offer her a dramatic rescue, not a sweeping gesture, not a speech for the room to admire. He simply stopped beside her with the ease of someone who belonged exactly where he stood. Lena finally looked up at him. There was no panic in her face, no pleading, no need. Only recognition, and something steadier beneath it. He gave her the smallest nod, a private acknowledgement that belonged to neither Daniel nor the crowd. The effect was immediate. Several heads turned. A woman near the back lowered her glass. Daniel's smile, which had survived by habit until that moment, faltered by degrees. He looked from Lena to the man beside her, then back again, as if the scene had rearranged itself into a language he could no longer read. The newcomer extended his hand not to Daniel, but to Lena, and she placed hers in it without hesitation. It was not a display. It was worse than that for the room watching. It was confidence, quiet and complete. One of the guests leaned toward another and whispered something behind a raised hand, but the words vanished into the hush. Daniel shifted his weight, trying to recover the posture of control, but the room had already begun to leave him behind. Lena stood a little taller now, not because she had changed in an instant, but because she was no longer standing alone under the weight of his attention. The man beside her turned his head toward Daniel at last, not sharply, not with contempt, but with the measured calm of someone who had already seen enough. And in that single look, Every assumption Daniel had built tonight began to crack. For the first time that evening, Lena allowed herself to breathe. Not deeply, not fully, but enough to feel the cool air settle in her chest as the room around her changed shape. Daniel was still standing near the center of the ballroom, his smile now fixed and brittle, while every glance that had once been aimed at her seemed to drift toward the man beside her instead. He noticed it too, not with pride, but with the calm certainty of someone who had never needed to announce his arrival to own the room. Lena kept her hand lightly in his, feeling the steady warmth of his grip, the kind of quiet reassurance that asked for nothing and gave everything. Around them, the chandeliers cast soft light across polished marble and the pale glow of orchids, but the atmosphere had shifted beyond decoration. Conversations that had been loud a moment ago now came in fragments, lower and more careful, as if everyone understood they were standing too close to a moment that would be remembered. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the center of attention, but the sound landed awkwardly, almost swallowed by the hush. Lena did not look at him. She had spent too many years learning the cost of giving men like him too much of herself, too much of her gaze, too much of her time. Tonight, she had no intention of offering him even that. The man beside her turned slightly, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable to everyone except her. There was no performance in the way he stood. No need for one. That, more than anything, unsettled the people watching. Power that needed applause always looked hungry. Power that did not need to ask for anything felt different. Daniel finally stepped forward, his voice careful now, almost polite, as though the truth of the last few seconds had already reached him and he was trying to pretend it had not. He said her name with the same mouth that had once used it like a warning, but Lena heard only the effort behind it. The room waited. The orchestra had not resumed. Even the staff moving along the edges of the ballroom seemed to slow, carrying trays and glassware with exaggerated silence. Lena felt the weight of every stare, but it no longer pressed her down. It moved around her now, unable to settle. The man beside her gave the smallest nod, a simple gesture, and Daniel's eyes narrowed in recognition as the meaning began to surface. Not because he had been told, because he was starting to understand. The woman he had tried to reduce to a memory was standing here in a different light, beside a man whose presence had altered the air itself. And Lena, still and composed, looked like someone who had already crossed the line between who she had been and who she had become. The man beside Lena did not reach for the microphone, did not seek the center of the room, and did not force the attention that was already moving toward him. He simply stood there, one hand resting loosely at his side, his posture so measured it almost seemed casual. But Lena could feel the shift around them, subtle and undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Daniel felt it too. His smile remained in place, but it had lost its warmth. It now looked painted on, a careful performance for a room that was no longer certain who it was meant to admire. Across the ballroom, several conversations had already faltered. One woman lowered her glass halfway to her lips and forgot to drink. A man near the far column turned his head again, as if checking whether he had truly seen what he thought he had seen. Lena kept her gaze level. She had spent too many years learning how to shrink herself in rooms like this, how to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss. Tonight, she did none of those things. She did not need to. The silence around her had begun to work in her favor. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped. The confidence he had worn so easily earlier now seemed to sit awkwardly on his shoulders. He looked from Lena to the man beside her and back again, as if trying to fit both figures into a story that no longer made sense. The man beside Lena turned slightly, just enough for Daniel to see him more clearly. It was not a dramatic movement. It did not need to be. Recognition landed slowly, then all at once. Daniel's face changed in the span of a heartbeat, the color draining just enough to make his expression look thin and uncertain. He knew that face. He knew that name, or the shadow of it. In the polished circles where deals were made and favors were remembered, some people never needed to speak loudly to be important. This was one of them. Lena saw the moment Daniel understood that the man at her side was not a guest, not an escort, and certainly not someone to be overlooked. He was the kind of man whose quiet carried more authority than Daniel's entire evening of polished noise. Around them, the ballroom seemed to tighten. Crystal light glimmered overhead, but the room had lost its shine. Even the music, still absent, left a hollow where the elegance should have been. Daniel wet his lips and tried to recover the expression he had worn before, the one that made him look amused, generous, untouchable. It did not fit anymore. "I was not expecting this," he said at last, his voice carefully controlled, though Lena could hear the strain under each word. The man beside her offered no reaction at all, no smile, no hostility, only a calm regard that made Daniel's nerves look louder by the second. Lena watched her ex-husband search the room for something familiar to cling to. He found nothing. Not pity, not sympathy, not a single face willing to help him regain the upper hand. The guests had begun to look at Lena differently now, not as the woman Daniel had tried to reduce to a footnote, but as the center of the room he had misjudged. She felt that change settle over her like a new coat, light but unmistakable. Daniel shifted again, less certain with every second. The man beside Lena finally spoke, his voice level and precise, carrying no effort at all. "You seem surprised." It was a simple sentence. Nothing more. But it landed with the weight of a locked door closing softly in the distance. Daniel forced a laugh that never fully formed. Lena did not move. She only stood there in the clean white light, her expression serene, her hands steady, her silence more powerful than any speech she could have given. And in that stillness, something inside Daniel began to unravel, thread by thread. The man beside Lena remained exactly where he was, as if he had stepped out of a different kind of world and brought its quiet gravity into the ballroom with him. No one rushed him. No one dared. The room seemed to understand, before Daniel did, that some people did not need to announce their power. They simply entered and changed the air. Lena felt it in the way the chandeliers above them no longer seemed bright enough, in the way every conversation around the room had thinned to a cautious hush. Daniel still wore the same polished smile, but now it looked strained at the edges, like lacquer over hairline cracks. He gave a small laugh, searching for control and finding only the echo of it. Lena did not look at him. She kept her attention on the man beside her, on the steady line of his shoulders, on the calm hand he extended toward the table where the program sheets had been left in perfect little stacks. It was such an ordinary gesture that it made the moment feel even more impossible. He picked up one sheet, glanced at it once, then set it back down as if he had already seen everything he needed to see. Daniel swallowed. That was the first time Lena noticed his uncertainty not as anger, but as fear dressed up in pride. A waiter passed too close and nearly stopped in place when he recognized the man at her side. The man did not react. He only shifted his gaze toward the stage, where the host had gone rigid behind the microphone, and gave a slight nod, patient and unreadable. Lena knew that look. It was the look of someone waiting for the room to catch up. Daniel tried again, his voice now softer, less certain. "I think there has been some misunderstanding." The words floated weakly through the air, and no one came to help him hold them up. The woman beside him lowered her glass. Someone near the back stopped smiling. The old hierarchy that Daniel had spent the night polishing began to tilt, almost imperceptibly, then all at once. Lena felt something inside her loosen. Not triumph. Not yet. Something quieter. The relief of no longer needing to shrink. For so long, she had been the one asked to explain herself, to soften her voice, to make herself smaller so other people could remain comfortable. But now she stood in a room where comfort had changed sides. The man beside her finally spoke again, his tone even, almost courteous. "You invited her here to be embarrassed." The sentence was not raised. It did not need to be. It landed cleanly, and the silence that followed was worse than any public argument could have been. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked from Lena to the man beside her, and then to the faces around him, searching for one person, just one, who might offer him a kinder version of reality. There was none. Lena lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in peace. She no longer needed to prove she belonged. She already did. And in that room of polished glass and expensive restraint, that was the most dangerous truth of all. The man beside her turned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable to everyone else, but clear enough for her to feel the meaning behind it. He was not there to rescue her from the past. He was there to stand with her in the present, where she had already become someone Daniel could no longer define. Around them, the room remained still, waiting for whatever came next. Daniel stood with the kind of stillness that came from a man who had spent years believing the room would always bend toward him. It did not bend now. Not for Lena, and certainly not for the quiet man beside her. Around them, the ballroom remained polished and bright, with its high chandeliers and mirrored walls, but the mood had changed. The laughter had thinned into cautious silence. The waitstaff had slowed their steps. Even the music, soft and elegant a moment ago, seemed to hover in the background like it was waiting for permission to continue. Daniel felt it first as irritation, then as unease, and finally as the cold, unmistakable edge of being outmatched. He looked at Lena as if she had become a stranger with excellent timing. Her face gave him nothing. No anger, no pleading, no need. She simply stood there in a pale dress that caught the light at the shoulders, her posture straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her calm more unsettling than any accusation could have been. He had expected tears, maybe a tremor in her voice, maybe the old version of her who used to look to him before she decided how to stand. Instead, she looked settled. Arrived, finished with the old story. A woman nearby cleared her throat and glanced away. Someone else lowered their glass without drinking. Daniel tried to laugh, but the sound never found its shape. "So this is what you came back with," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "A silent audience and a man who stands behind you." The words were meant to regain the room. They only exposed him more. The man beside Lena did not react. He kept his gaze level, not cold, not warm, simply exact. It was the kind of look that made men like Daniel feel their own habits, their own assumptions, begin to look small and tired. Then he spoke, his voice calm enough to make the air feel sharper. "You asked her to come here to be embarrassed." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The sentence moved through the room cleanly, and every person near enough to hear it understood its weight. Daniel blinked once, then again. For a brief moment, all the polish in his face slipped. Lena did not look at him. She looked past him, toward the long windows that reflected the city lights outside, as if she were no longer waiting for his reaction to define the night. Her silence was no longer a shield. It was a boundary, and Daniel, standing in front of it, had no idea how to cross. A soft murmur moved through the guests, one table to the next, like a current passing under the floorboards. The woman at the edge of the dance floor lifted her phone slightly, then thought better of it and lowered it again. Everyone could feel that something was about to give, but no one could name it yet. The man beside Lena finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge Daniel, without granting him comfort. "You should be careful," he said. "People remember how they were treated." Daniel swallowed hard, his jaw tightening in a way that exposed the pulse at his temple. For the first time that evening, he seemed smaller than the polished image he had worked so hard to project. Not ruined, not defeated, just suddenly ordinary in a room that no longer admired him. Lena breathed in slowly. The air smelled of expensive flowers, polished wood, and the faint trace of champagne, but none of it felt as important as the quiet forming around her. She had once entered rooms like this with her heart braced for impact, ready to shrink before anyone else could push. Tonight, she stood in the center of one and did not move. The man beside her adjusted his stance, not protectively, but naturally, as though standing with her was the simplest thing in the world. That small gesture seemed to settle something in her chest. She had not come here to be rescued. She had come here to be seen. And now she was. Daniel searched her face one more time, perhaps hoping for the slightest crack in her composure, some familiar weakness he could name and use. He found none, only that steady, almost gentle stillness, and behind it a life he no longer understood. The room waited. The lights held steady above them, and in that suspended silence, Lena knew the worst part was over. The rest would be memory. The man beside Lena did not need to speak first. He let the silence settle, let the room feel its own discomfort, and only then did he turn slightly toward the table nearest the center of the ballroom. A folder rested there, black and slim beneath the chandelier light, the kind of document that looked unremarkable until someone understood what it meant. Daniel noticed it at the same time Lena did. His eyes narrowed, then flicked away, then returned with the thin, impatient confidence of a man who still believed the room belonged to him. But the atmosphere had changed too much for confidence to hold. Lena stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, her face calm, almost distant, as if she were no longer waiting for permission from anyone in the room. The The man beside her lifted the folder and opened it with unhurried care. A few people in the front row leaned in without realizing they were doing it. No one spoke. The soft clink of glass from the far end of the ballroom sounded suddenly too loud. The papers inside were neat, official, stamped and signed in places that made them impossible to ignore. Daniel's expression shifted in small, ugly increments. First annoyance, then confusion, then the first trace of alarm he could not hide fast enough. He took one step forward, but the man beside Lena did not move to meet him. He only looked at the page in front of him, then at Lena, as if confirming something already settled long ago. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the waitstaff had gone still near the walls, trays suspended at their sides. Lena could feel every eye working over her, searching her for the crack they expected to find. Years ago, they would have found one. Years ago, she would have lowered her gaze, folded herself inward, and tried to survive the moment by becoming smaller than it was. Tonight, she remained exactly as she was. Her posture straight, her expression composed, her breathing even. The quiet man beside her turned one page, then another, and finally closed the folder with the soft finality of a door shutting. When he looked up again, it was not with cruelty. It was with the measured calm of someone preparing to say something that could not be taken back. Daniel's jaw tightened. A vein moved once at his temple. Lena saw it, and for the first time that evening, something almost like pity passed through her before disappearing. Not because he was harmless, because he was no longer powerful enough to matter the way he once had. The man beside her said a few words so quietly that only those nearest could hear them, yet the effect spread instantly. A ripple moved through the front of the room. One woman covered her mouth. Someone else turned sharply toward Daniel. His face went pale in stages, as if the blood had been carefully withdrawn from him 1 inch at a time. Lena did not look at the others. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the point just beyond the chandeliers, where the reflection of the room shimmered in the mirrored wall. She had spent too many years watching herself through other people's disappointment. Tonight, she was done with that. The man beside her shifted the folder toward the host at the edge of the stage, and the host's hand trembled when he accepted it. The microphone remained untouched for a moment longer, as if everyone understood that what came next did not need volume. It only needed to be true. Daniel finally broke the silence. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin and uncertain. His eyes darted from the folder to Lena, then to the man beside her, as if he were trying to place a face he should already know. That search lasted only a second longer. Then recognition struck him. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. Enough for his shoulders to stiffen. Enough for the smile to disappear from his mouth. Enough for the room to begin leaning toward the answer before it had been spoken aloud. And Lena, standing in the center of all that stillness, felt nothing rush in to save him. Nothing hurried to soften the moment. The truth had arrived wearing polished shoes and an even voice, and it would not leave quietly. Lena did not move. The room had already given her everything it was willing to give. The stares, the whispers, the pause that felt like a held breath. Now it waited for her to fall apart, or to explain herself, or to plead for mercy from a past that no longer owned her. But Lena only lifted her chin a fraction, as if she were listening to something far more important than the men who had once decided her worth in a matter of seconds. Beside her, the man remained calm, one hand resting lightly at his side, his presence measured and unshaken. He did not crowd her. He did not speak for her. He simply stood there, as if silence itself had become a kind of authority. Daniel looked from the black folder to Lena, and then back again, the color draining from his face in slow, unflattering waves. The polished certainty he had brought into the ballroom had begun to crack, and everyone could see it. Even the people who had pretended not to care were now watching with the fierce attention of witnesses who had finally sensed the shape of the truth. The host, still holding the folder, glanced toward the stage as though waiting for permission to breathe. The man beside Lena gave none. He only inclined his head once, a small motion that carried the weight of a decision already made. When he finally reached for the microphone, he did it without haste, and that unhurried calm seemed to unsettle the room more than any sharp announcement ever could. His voice, when it came, was low and even, carrying clearly through the ballroom without needing to rise. He did not waste a word. He stated Lena's name with the quiet respect of someone introducing a person whose value had never needed permission. Then he turned slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the entire room, and the gesture felt deliberate, almost formal, like a door opening in a place where no one had expected one. Daniel swallowed hard. He tried to recover the arrogance in his posture, but it would not return. Not now. Not with every eye shifting toward the folder, toward the stage, toward the woman he had once dismissed so easily. Lena saw it all without changing her expression. She did not smile in triumph. She did not look at Daniel with pity. She looked past him, past the old wound, past the version of herself that had once measured her worth by his cruelty. In that polished ballroom, beneath the chandelier light and the soft rustle of expensive fabric, she felt something settle inside her at last. Not victory exactly. Something quieter. Something harder earned. The man beside her set the folder down, and when the host opened it, the first page caught the light. A murmur moved through the room like a sudden breeze through open windows. Daniel's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. He understood now that he had arrived too late to rewrite the story. The room, which had once belonged to him, now belonged to the truth. And Lena, standing straight as winter glass, let that truth unfold without rushing to claim it. She did not need to. It was already hers.